how effective is these continuous sanctions and economic and defense pressure to counter or compel Russia to negotiate peace?
I haven't observed that they are very effective at all, for the simple reason that, well, for a number of not so simple reasons. One is that the economic stranglehold that was threatened against Russia from the beginning, from February 2022, has simply not been total. The Russian banking system has not been totally thrown out of SWIFT. Russia continues to be allowed to export oil and gas, less than before, under price caps, yes, but they continue to be able to do it. And even a major Western ally, which is India, has been more or less allowed by the Biden administration to buy significant amounts of oil from Russia, to the point where the proportion of Russian oil that constitutes the oil imports of India is now like many times larger than it was before. And of course, they have markets in the Far East and China. Moreover, Putin has essentially rebuilt his economy to be a war economy that is prepared to withstand the impact of the war for many years going forward. And the nature of his kleptocracy is such that he has been able to buy the loyalty of his entire coterie of military, well, much of his coterie of military and political adjutants. So they may be able to survive unless the West really takes significant action of a nature that would involve also a great disruption of global oil markets and in general global markets. That would involve the West being able to absorb some pain. They haven't really shown that. This statement coming out of Finland seems like a step forward, but in a way it reflects what I believe was at least the unspoken European consensus or Western consensus for a while, which is that the war should freeze at the current lines and negotiations should begin. And then the question is, what does that mean? Does that mean Ukraine has agreed essentially to give up 85 to 90% of the Donbass, the eastern part of Ukraine, and other bits of Ukraine, including Crimea? Ukraine is essentially not currently in control of about 20% of its territory. If we freeze the lines where we currently are, which is what this statement out of Finland says, well, does that mean Ukraine agrees that those territories, which are essentially annexed by Russia by now, remain with Russia? They're going to say no, but the music says yes, basically. And that is doubly so when we see that Donald Trump has essentially told Zelensky that you have to basically forget about those territories. The major frustration on the part of the Europeans, is that Donald Trump's position is completely unpredictable and inconsistent. One day he says Ukraine can recover all its territory. The next day, after talking to Putin, he again is screaming at Zelensky to give up the territory. One day he's going to give Ukraine tomahawks, the next day he's not. It clearly looks like Trump is a non-dependable ally in this regard, and that may be hastening Europe's understanding as well that the war really needs to come to an end because the U.S. is basically not to be dependent on. The big, enormous question is if Putin is allowed to hold on to 20% of Ukraine as a consequence of Russia's naked and clearly illegal aggression that has no justification conceivable, does that reward such aggression in a way that encourages repeat cases? And what can Europe, for example, do to avoid that narrative from settling in that Putin won the war? And to my mind, since I do believe NATO membership for Ukraine is off the table, and indeed NATO membership for Ukraine isn't as important as it seems, because you can be defended under something similar to Article 5 of NATO, even without being a member of NATO, as indeed Ukraine has been defended. The main thing Europe can do is to fast-track EU membership for Ukraine. And I believe this is actually the more important. Ukraine already has a military that's better than any in Europe. What Ukraine needs is stability, regional institutional guarantees, and the prosperity that will come from membership in the European Union. And that needs to be at a minimum the reward for, 3.5 years of basically standing up for the West in the face of the most naked aggression.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Dan, for joining us and sharing that insight throughout our news. That was Dan Perry. He's a political analyst, joined us live from Tel Aviv.